So it's indeed, ladies and gentlemen, my enormous pleasure and privilege to introduce Craig Shelton. Now, I have had a career in chemistry for many years, but Craig Shelton is one of the most unique individuals it's been my pleasure and privilege to ever introduce. And I'll tell you how it got started. So Craig Shelton has an absolutely incredible background. He started off by being a he got a master's degree in biochemistry at Yale University. Now, those credentials are impressive enough. He had been admitted to the MD PhD program at Harvard. Now, most people would simply say, yes, absolutely, I have achieved a major dream. But in those intervening 3 months, Craig went off on a little bit of an excursion to France, where he got extremely fond of fine dining and decided he's going to have a change in career and decided to become a absolutely star master chef. He apprenticed himself in some incredible restaurants. Yeah, all of you know them as the Guide Michelin, the three-star restaurants. And he has continued this passion. He has run inns in New Jersey and now is doing so much for food as medicine in the state of California. I was a spellbound listener to his. I was planning a lot of his live demonstrations, which will happen next year. But without much further ado, I realize you are here to hear him speak and not me speak. So, Craig Shelton, over to you, and allow me to reiterate what an incredible pleasure it is to welcome you here.
Well, Dr. Chergati, thank you so much. I'm absolutely honored to be asked to speak before the August Society, the Royal Society of Chemistry, as well as our American Chemical Society. I'll be discussing today my dynamic food and wine pairing model, something I created about 40 years ago, right after graduating with my degree in molecular biophysics and biochemistry from Yale University. I just want to clarify, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. I was not accepted into Harvard. I was intending to apply, but my trips to France and my decision to go into cooking were what the sequence was. That was first. And so I never did complete that application. Well, again, there is across the world the fascination with wine and how it interacts with food is legendary. And up until this point, we've had competing ideas of gastronomic principles in the East and in the West. And there's something absolutely wonderful about the fact that because both of these paradigms seem to produce wonderful results, the assumption sets being that are required of each of them excludes the other. And therefore, there must be something else that's really going on. So we start with is the idea that the sense organs of the palate, in fact, all the sense organs, even vision, sight, touch, all perception, all these sense organs seem to operate in a relativistic fashion, meaning your tongue doesn't tell you the exact pH of a substance. It tastes, it can't do that with any real accuracy. What it can do with extreme accuracy, if it's trained, is to tell you how much more acidic something is than the thing you just tasted right before. So it's very good at analyzing relative degrees of things in sequence, but it's not very good at locating it on an absolute scale. And the other thing is that it is very selective in what it pays attention to. You can walk into a rock and roll concert and the noise level is brutal in the beginning. It's painful, but after a few moments, you adjust to it, and your entire sensitivity downregulates, so that it at some point feels almost normal. It's another similar thing to when a lady may walk into a room doused in perfume and it bowls you over for a few seconds. Very shortly thereafter, your system downregulates and it essentially turns it into the background, where you at some point you essentially almost don't notice it any longer. So it is extraordinarily complex how these sense organs work. Unfortunately, the conventional thinking on food and wine pairing uses a static model that does not acknowledge the dynamic behavior of our sense organs in relationship to stimuli, positing instead a rationale of identity. That is, in the West, we talk about it as if the wine and food share most of the same aromas, then the pairing should work together. As an example, if there is a predominant nose of vanilla in the wine and a predominant nose of vanilla in the dish, then they should work well together. Conversely, in some nations of the East, such as India, the opposite principle is assumed. Culinary excellence is achieved when no two elements on the plate are the same. So on the one hand, we have an explanatory model of identity, and on the other one, we have an explanatory model of difference. Obviously, these principles are antithetical to each other, and yet excellence at the table is achieved in both regions. Therefore, we conclude that since both the Eastern and Western explanatory models logically exclude the possibility of the other approach working, neither of them is the satisfactory paradigm for explaining what they purport to explain. Recognizing the foundational errors of both the Eastern and Western standard models, I created an alternative model 40 years ago that is based in neurophysics, neurophysiology, and other sciences. So the standard model posits a rationale of identity. If the food and wine share most of the same aromas, then the pairing should be successful. It is therefore a static model. The intellectual error of this model creates many failed tasting experiences in which the wine appears to go bad during the meal. Now, when I had my own restaurant in New Jersey for about 20 years, countless times, at least I think almost 1,000 times, when I would go out to the tables and talk to people about their wine selections or their food, their dish, whatever the conversation was, very often they would say to me, you know, Craig, we were at another restaurant and we ordered a very lovely bottle of wine, but it went bad during the meal. And of course, I couldn't have the heart to tell them that that's impossible. That in fact, if a wine is already good in the first taste, it remains good. But what can happen is if it is served with food that clashes with it, then it can appear to go bad. So this dynamic wine and food pairing model challenges the rationale of the static model. Okay, it's based upon the scientific understanding of physiology of the sense organs responsible for taste and all the chemical and physical interactions. It's based upon the seminal work of Yale Professor Shepard. I took Gordon Shepard's course on neurophysiology of the senses while an undergraduate at Yale University as part of my degree in molecular biophysics and biochemistry. My model applies the first principles of neurophysiology to a lifetime of organoleptic tasting experience and elucidates how the various properties in the wine, as well as the various properties in the foods, interact dynamically. The neuroscience behind it can include biomechanics, physiology, and neuroscience, and even fluid dynamics. These neurological insights are coupled with basics of other traditional sciences such as biology, chemistry, and physics. Some taste characteristics are subtractive, such as acidity or sweetness. If you taste some food that is sweet, it is going to reduce the perception of something else that follows that is sweet. In other words, if I'm tasting a very sweet wine, then it's going to reduce my perception of sweetness in the food that follows, or vice versa. If I start with a sweet food, it's going to reduce how much sweetness I can detect in the wine that immediately follows. Same thing with acidity. If I were to, example, bite into a lemon, that very high level of acidity will reduce my palate's ability to perceive the amount of acidity that's truly there. I will undervalue it. On the other hand, some taste characteristics are additive, meaning with each successive encounter of this type of substance, the intensity grows. Good examples of this are astringency, or the tannins in the wine, or spice heat, capsicum. In other words, we can, with each taste of a hot pepper, a hot chili pepper, the intensity of the heat may become higher and higher and higher. Some taste characteristics are positively interactive. Astringency and spice heat together amplify each other. In other words, eating some hot pepper irritates the taste organs, and then when you have an astringent wine, irritates it further, and it builds successively to higher and higher levels of sensitivity. Some taste characteristics are inversely interactive. For example, are fat and astringency. A very fatty dish will lower the palate's ability to perceive astringency in the wine. These are examples. To me, however, this dynamic interaction of taste that between the qualities of the wine, primarily as a food substance, not as an aromatic, and the characteristics of the food, these basic characteristics of acidity, sweetness, astringency, these interactions are far more important to the success of the wine pairing. In fact, I basically call this the first step in wine pairing. To skip it is not to make a wine pairing at all. Whereas the aromatic similarities or contrast are more cosmetic. So the neuroenology, how the brain creates the taste of wine. The brain creates taste. An analogy one can use is color. The objects we see do not have color themselves. Light hits them and bounces off. It's when light strikes our eyes that it activates systems in the brain that create color from those different wavelengths. Similarly, the molecules in wine don't have taste or flavor, but when they stimulate our brains, the brain creates flavor the same way it creates color. We have to understand that there are different ways to approach wine too, the bouquet and the aroma. When you sniff wine in the glass, you appreciate the bouquet. And there are two different forms of that, orthonasal and retronasal. Orthonasal is before it's in the mouth, you breathe in. Retronasal is when it's in the mouth and it's interacting with saliva, and it's being warmed by the body heat. And then some of these smells, aromas come up through the nasal canal, and you smell them in the nose in this fashion. And there is a contrast between these two, and it is valuable information. Saliva has enzymes that break down various molecules in the wine to create new compounds or building blocks of larger molecules. As they break down, become apparent and effervesce into the air to stimulate the smell receptors in your nose. This produces new compounds that were not originally in the wine. They were created by this enzymatic interaction. Now, how subjective is taste? Yes, it is true that there is subjectivity in taste, and I think that that is an important statement. But I think it's every bit as important to emphasize what is common amongst all of us human beings. We all have about 350 different tastes, different kinds of olfactory receptors. Probably 90% of those are the same from one human being to the next, and only 10% really vary. That's part of the pleasure of wine, comparing your pleasure to other people's pleasure. There are such things as super tasters. I just happen to be one. There's a little test of a chemical on a tablet a little piece of paper that you can put in your mouth, and a great majority of people won't sense anything at all. Some people will have a little bit of bitterness. Some people, it will be very, very bad bitterness. And for someone like me, I can walk around with that horrible bitterness for several days after. This is really just a reflection of the quantity of taste buds, and not the quality of them. So the first question that a lot of people ask me is, what can I do to improve my wine tasting abilities? Okay. And the single most important advice I could give to anyone is to slow down, especially here in America where everything is so busy. We need to take our time. I'll give you a sort of comparison with, say, if you were studying film. If you were studying a film to write a paper for film class, and you had a choice between watching the film at normal speed, or watching the film at double speed, watching the film at quadruple speed, or watching the film at half speed, in which of those scenarios could you observe the greatest amount of detail? And obviously, the slower the speed, the more detail you can pick up. Pauline Kael once wrote a book on a single movie, Citizen Kane, in which she stopped the film frame by frame, literally watching the film as what it actually is, a sequence of still images, which through motion appear to be moving. And it was an impressive analysis. So what you will see in America especially, but even occasionally in Europe, is that when you hand someone a wine, and the first thing that they will do is immediately start to swirl it. And then smell it. It is really unfortunate that we haven't explained to people what the swirling is all about. And we're going to go into that, and it's going to become very apparent right after we discuss about some of the principles that we use to understand wine as an active food substance, as a reactive food substance, just as food is a reactive substance very often. So we begin by understanding the life cycle of wine. Grape juice is fermented. The sugars in the grape juice are turned into alcohol through microorganisms called yeast, producing a byproduct of carbon dioxide and the alcohol. We can talk about the birth of wine arbitrarily as when it's first bottled. This is a false declaration. It really is becoming wine as soon as alcohol is created. But for the purpose of pairing wine, we're never going to be pairing wine that's in the vat. We're going to only pair wine once it's bottled. We can talk about a life cycle where, as it is in the bottle, we can call that gestation. It begins to age and increasing complexity, reaching through teenage years, young adulthood, until it finally reaches maturity, or what I like to call the beautiful plateau, in which the maximum complexity that shall ever be reached, coupled with the maximum beauty, this is a plateau. And then the wine shall begin to decline, aging, old age, and finally death, vinegar, or other unpalatable things. So this is extremely important to understand, because it presents various pairing situations. When the wine is on that beautiful plateau, or even just a little bit before that point, I can call that a noble wine potential pairing situation, potentially. We will get into that. But assuming that it is meets all the qualifications of being a noble wine, that is from a type of grape that has proven itself for tens of decades or even multiple centuries of being able to produce a wine that can age long-term, very long-term, with increasing complexity and beauty, and that nothing has gone wrong in the whole process to this point. And it's at that peak of complexity and beauty, then I call that a noble pairing situation. Anything other than that is not. So part of what that whole swirling thing about is to tell us this information of where this wine is on its life cycle. There are other clues. Sometimes we look at the wine, and if we see a clear band on the edge, the wider that clear band is, tends to indicate increasing age. When we look at a wine, if it's just uniformly in one color across, that tends to indicate youth. As it begins to have more hues, it's almost like a spectrum on the edges, slightly lighter colors and getting more and more complex as and in the thicker depths, this is generally an indicator of age. Now, the still nose versus the swirled nose is one of the most important tools that wine aficionados use, especially traditionally. When you think about what the job of a sommelier should be, what the job of a wine buyer should be, they're generally going to these chateaus of Europe, into the cellars where the wines are still in casks. And they're going to choose which of these casks they want to buy the wine from. And this is an important thing to understand, is that there can be very large, very significant cask variation, even in the same wine. But far more importantly is the variation in different wines within the same cellar. So in France, for example, a winemaker may own dozens of different vineyards. Each has a different name. One might be Chassagne-Montrachet Village. One might be Puy-Montrachet Premier Cru. One might be a Grand Cru. And they're all in different casks. And just because it was a good vintage or just because it was a bad vintage doesn't mean all the wines will succeed uniformly or fail uniformly. There's going to be, in every cellar I've ever visited, sometimes dramatic differences of success from one vineyard to the next. And so part of the valuation of wines, before America invented the point system, which biased wines towards how quickly they can give maximum sensory detail, even in youth, that seemed to give a bit of bias to wines that are more or less have succeeded in achieving a life cycle which is rapidly achieves its peak and plateau, as opposed to more of the traditional old world wines that are very slow and long to achieve that plateau. However, just at this first purpose of analyzing the wine, what has traditionally, probably more than any other factor, determined the value of a wine year over year over year was this particular plot of land with this particular arrangement of grapes has produced wines that for the last 10 decades or centuries has been able to last the longest in the bottle with increasing complexity. So this particular parcel of land right here has produced a wine in good vintages that will take 40 years to reach its plateau. Another parcel over there, 80 years. A parcel just next to it might be only 20 years. And the pricing of these wines has traditionally been exponentially related to the ability to age with increasing complexity. And this is why the swirling has become so important. So what it basically represents, if you went into the cellar and they poured you a bottle, or they took some wine out of a vat, they would put it in a glass for you. And the first thing you would do is not swirl it. What you would do is you would register the still nose. In a certain sense, this is saying where the wine is today in this present moment. And the key here is to train your lung muscles, your rib muscles, your chest muscles to breathe in as slowly as humanly possible. Because the more slowly you move those molecules across the receptors in your nasal cavity, the greater your ability to pick apart the aromas that are there. But it's kind of like gas chromatography. The more slowly you run the process, perhaps the more exactitude can be achieved. So you register the still nose. You also move. Sometimes you're putting your nose right to the tip, touching it, the edge of the glass. You're only going to sense those molecules that can rise this high, but not higher. Sometimes you're going at a much higher distance. Sometimes you're changing from one nostril to the other because they do have a difference in what they emphasize. Once you think that you have that picture in your mind, that aromatic picture, you sort of memorize it you say, strawberries, currants. It really doesn't matter that you can name it as much as you can memorize it. The next thing you'll do is now you will start swirling gently at first, and then more vigorously and more vigorously and more vigorously, doing the same tilting of the head or positions. What is going on here is you're aerating the wine. You're forcing redox reactions. You're forcing oxygen to interact with those active chemical models. You're forcing the kind of chemical reactions that are going to happen in the bottle anyway, but over a long period of time. Another way of thinking of it, this is like the fast forward button on your remote control to the VCR. For those of you who are young, who don't know what a VCR is, it was a mysterious contraption that no one could figure out. And you would have tapes of video of movies, and you would play them, and the remote control was the bane of everyone's existence. However, so the most important thing that we're doing here is we are trying to register, is there a delta of quality between the still nose and the swirled nose? Not is it more intense only. Of course it's going to be more intense. It's like if you think of a rheostat, that circular knob on the wall, that if you turn it, the light becomes more bright or it diminishes. That's a question of intensity, not a change in the spectrum of the light waves being emitted. If the wine is at the peak, that beautiful plateau, generally speaking, there will be no new aromas, no new smells, no new items that become into existence from chemical reaction. It will simply be more intensity, like the rheostat. But if the wine is early in development, let's say at the base of the plateau, then when you swirl, you will see new things appear that weren't there in the still nose. And the harder you swirl, the more new things will begin to appear. Now, this may seem rather crude, rather primitive, but I can tell you that people who study for the Master of Wine or the Master Sommelier exam can use this simple tool with such incredible precision that it puts to shame some laboratory equipment. So, estimating the delta You take clues, first of all, from the bottle of wine, if you're given one. Oh, I can tell by the shape of this bottle, it's probably from Burgundy. Oh, I can tell by the color of the wine, it's a red. Oh, et cetera, et cetera. But very often in wine tasting, you're given a bit of this wine blind. You have no idea other than its color. Is it white? Is it red? Is it rosé? Is it orange? And you use a process of deductive reasoning from there. So once we have done this first level calculation of the still nose versus the swirled nose, we now move into the taste. And it's the same process. We do the still taste. We put a little bit of wine in our mouth and we leave it alone. We don't start all this aspirating. No, we first leave it alone and let the aromas come up retronasally, as we mentioned earlier. And we pay attention with this lack of motion. Sometimes when we feel we've registered it, we may begin to move our tongue back and forth a little, just a small amount of agitation to start the oxygenation and the warming. And then, and only then, when we feel we've taken that snapshot picture of the aromatic profile, then we begin the aspiration, which is doing the same type of thing as the swirling in the glass. It's forcing oxygen reaction to the active compounds at an accelerated rate. But in addition, we now have saliva working as chemical scissors, opening up more molecules that were hidden in long chain length. And we have the warmth of the mouth also accelerating the oxygenation reactions and the enzymatic reactions. This gives us a tremendous amount of information. And once again, it's the same principle. If there is any difference at all in terms of what is present, then this means the wine is not on the beginning of the plateau. If those new flavors or new smells are off-putting or outright bad, then it means the wine is at the end of its beautiful plateau, and the further oxygenating is driving it to its decay stage. As long as the new flavors in the swirled or aspirated mouth are pretty, lovely, nice, enchanting, desirable, then we know the wine still has plenty of room to age. And as I said before, if there's not a lot of difference between the still and the swirled, or between the still taste and the aspirated taste, these are indicators that the wine is on its plateau. And this is vitally, vitally important when we come to marrying food with wine. To know where it is on the life cycle is primordially important. Now, we talked about all the other types of sciences that can come into helping us with this pairing. And let's just go some of the things we learned in high school or in junior high school on geography. The effects of latitude. As we go away from the equator, north or south, there's less effective sunlight per square meter. Therefore, we call it cooler and cooler and cooler and cooler climes. On this basis of latitude, we can predict on a relative basis, will a wine take longer to reach its full alcohol level, or will it be shorter? And obviously, in hotter climates, there's more energy reacting with the chlorophyll, creating the sugar in a faster rate, and in general, creating more sugar. So the closer to the equator, all else being equal, the grape juice will be sweeter, and it'll be sweeter more early in the season. The farther we get from the equator, the opposite. Altitude or elevation works in a similar fashion. Typically, the closer we are to ground level, the more effective the sunlight, the higher in elevation, the cooler the climate, the slower the process occurs. And it's not just a question of slower, it's also that often in the hot climates, it will produce so much sugar that not all of it can be converted into alcohol, and we end up with residual sugar, sugar that is going to remain there into the wine. This is why, in general, and we start with generalities because we must, otherwise deductive reasoning would be fruitless. But in general, the driest wines from hot climates, and we can refer to the New World wines, Australian and American, as generally speaking, relatively speaking, hotter climate wines. The driest wines of these hotter climates will generally be sweeter than the sweetest dry wines of the old countries, the European cooler climates. It helps one to start to locate where this wine might be from. Proximity to water plays a role. Because water can be a heat sink and modulate climate. Generally speaking, the vines, the grapes on the vine, often have more success when they are near bodies of water, rivers or lakes, because the climate is more modulated. There's less amplitude than from day to night in areas without that modulation factor. Soil structures. We could now go into geology. The amount of drainage, how quickly water will drain. And of course, the mineral contents, all of these things play an important role in the characteristics of wine. Terroir is a French term that basically conflates all of these different influences, and such that a particular patch of soil has a particular characteristic that professional, very highly achieved tasters can pick out. 30 years ago, when I was studying very, very deeply and contemplating the MW myself and practicing for it, I got to be very good at it. And people could put in front of me a glass of wine, white or red. And there was a point at which I could, with old world wines, not so much with new world, but with old world wines, I could very often tell you which parcel of land it was from. And sometimes even who made it and in what year. And it's all just a process of elimination, in the same way that your very famous fictional character of Sherlock Holmes would solve a crime by process of elimination. So similar to these patterns we're noticing in a wine. Is it physiologically reactive highly? Is it young? Is it on the plateau? Is it over the hill? All of these things we can tell from just these little tools of swirl and still, aspirated and still. So some of the things we look for in food are those primary qualities that are going to potentially change the way a wine is perceived by the palate. They are sweetness, fat, acidity, bitterness, heat, spice, and umami, that proteiny type quality. It has been argued lately that there are many forms of umami, 6 or 7. So if we go back into the classic era, one of the things that people might order, oysters on the half shell. And were you to ask any sommelier, as I remember the period in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you would ask a sommelier, what wine do you recommend for my oysters on the half shell? Invariably, they would bring out a white Loire or most likely, if it was a high-end restaurant, a bottle of Chablis, and probably a bottle of Village Chablis, AOC, and very young. And you would ask them for the rationale. Why this Chardonnay from the most northern part of Burgundy, coolest of all climes of Burgundy? And they would immediately jump into the story of the nose. And they would talk about how the vineyards were at one point under and there was seashells, and there's all this calcare, the calcium from and the nose of the wine, and records the nose of the soil, and all of this and that. And unfortunately, there's just enough of a germ of truth to that to have sustained itself for decades, perhaps even centuries. But here's the problem. If you were to taste that Chablis, that young Chablis, by itself at a wine tasting or at a cocktail party, most people will conveniently forget that glass somewhere nearby on a console, because the wine is so highly acidic and all closed up and not giving of its fruit. It's so early on the life phase. However, if you first bite into a lemon, try this at home. Get a very, very, very young bottle of Chablis. Super cool, the coldest climate in the north of the equator, where Chardonnay is made without turning it into a sparkling wine. And try it by itself. And normally when I'm teaching this class, I have people right around me who do this so that you can see their reactions. And I have this same presentation on my YouTube channel. So if you search my name, you'll find it with the full, 5 or 6 people who are tasting along, so you can experience that as well. But here's what I want you to do at home. You take the Chablis, you taste it, you do the same thing, the still nose, the swirled nose. You do the still in the mouth, then you do the aspirated mouth. And then you make your assessment. My God, this wine is highly acidic. It's all locked up and tight. It's very young. It's almost infanticide to drink it now. Now what I want you to do is take a wedge of lemon, bite into it, spread it all around so that all the surfaces of your palate, under the tongue, the cheeks, the lips, everywhere, uniform treatment. Immediately thereafter, taste the wine again, and something miraculous will have happened. It will be as if this wine has aged 5 or 6 years. Suddenly, it doesn't taste acidic. It tastes full and rich. Suddenly, the fruit is opening up on you. It's nothing short of a miracle. I want you to imagine exactly the opposite case. A wine that was over the hill, right on the last precipice of that beautiful plateau, about to go down, and you were to serve a highly acidic dish. Well, what tiny little bit of acidity is still there would be masked and forcing it, the perception of it, down into its future decay. So what we really discovered by this experiment is that what was really being paired was not the oyster with the Chablis. It was the lemon that is put on the oysters of the half shell. There's always raw lemons, half lemons, or mignonette sauce, which is essentially pure vinegar. So the recommendation for the wine was about the condiment, not about the oyster itself. The ultra high amount of acidity in the vinegar sauce or in the lemon only super young wine could stand up to that amount of acid assault. Now, someone like me, I don't use mignonette sauce. I don't use lemon juice. When I have oysters on the half shell, I eat them pure, natural, no condiment whatsoever. So if you were going to recommend to me that same super young Chablis, that would be a terrible pairing. Chablis might itself, the concept of Chablis, the Chardonnay with all that minerality might be a wonderful pairing, but not a young one. You might, for someone who's a purist, you might say, I would like you to try the Premier Cru or the Grand Cru Chablis, depending on your budget, with 10, 15, 20 years of age. Now let's see what happens. Because remember, the oyster itself is physiologically neutral. When I say physiologically, I'm using a metaphor of how it interacts with the other food substance, with the wine. The oyster is not terribly fatty. It's not acidic. It's not significantly sweet. It's not bitter. It doesn't have that astringency. It's not spicy. Yes, it has protein. Yes, it has some umami. But it's a relatively neutral food substance up against wine. So this is more of a noble situation food. A wine that is nearing or at the plateau with a food that is not going to disturb it. That's the more appropriate situation there. So that is more what I call the noble pairing, where the wine is at right just before or on that plateau, and you serve it with a food that is neutral, that won't change the perception of the wine. An opposite, or I sometimes call them peasant cuisine style pairings, is when those conditions don't hold. And what is going to happen is the flaw in a wine, in this case for the oysters on the half shell with mignonette sauce or lemon juice, the flaw in the wine was only that it was too young. But the flaw in the food, the heavy acidic condiment, the lemon juice or the vinegar, the flaw in the food neutralizes the flaw in the wine, and the flaw in the wine neutralizes the flaw in the food, and it seems to elevate both. One of the most classic examples of this is cassoulet. Cassoulet is a peasant-style stew of white beans, tarbé, with duck confit or goose confit, sometimes sausages and bacon and all. It is extremely fatty. It's the type of dish where if you eat it by itself, unless you are savagely hungry, it can become cloying after a while. 2, 3 bites of it, and you may see that the fattiness of the dish is fatiguing you. The classic wine to pair with this is a Madaran made from the Tannat, grape Tannat, I believe, called because it's so damn tannic. It's the type of wine that in youth, if you spill it on the floor, it can lift paint. I'm exaggerating. But it is extremely tannic and can be very long to age. But when you pair this highly tannic wine with this highly fatty dish, the tannin in the wine activates or excites the taste buds, even as the fat sort of modulates them, and they achieve a beautiful balance. It is like a dish which was merely good suddenly becomes grand. A wine which wasn't that pleasant becomes thrilling. So we begin to see these patterns. Supposing I now take a situation where we start with a chosen bottle of wine. Let's say we have a young red claret, right? Well, that's redundant. Supposing we have a young claret, a red Bordeaux, and it is extremely tannic because of its youth. We've already identified the fact that it is not going to be a noble pairing because the wine has a flaw, and the flaw is youth. It's too young. However, we can use food to deal with this problem. There are a number of things that will reduce the palate's ability to perceive the tannin in the wine, or the bitterness, the astringency. And they are in food. If we have a food that is sweet, a food that is fatty, a food that is high in acidity, and protein and enzyme. Fat, acid, sweetness, protein, and enzyme. And by the way, all of these are found in blue cheese, like Roquefort, like Stilton. So with a very, very young wine, red wine like this would happen to me. And I think that we were very well known for doing something that perhaps we're aware of no other restaurant that ever did this. We just don't know of any. But every single bottle of wine that was ordered at my restaurant, the Ryland Inn, in those years, a copy of that dupe would be sent into the kitchen so I could look at it and match it with the food that was ordered. And then I would shout out the instructions to the cooks on how to modify the dishes that that client had ordered with that bottle of wine. Now, typically in America, if there are 4 people at a table, they're sharing the same bottle of wine, but very often they're all having different dishes, which makes it even more complex. An example of this, imagine table 1 has a bottle of 1989 Le Montrachet Marcolin, one of the greatest white wines ever made. And the table next to it has a bottle, the same maker, the same vineyard, Marcolin Montrachet, from, say, a vintage 10 years later, or even 20 years later. Okay, all the same except for age. I would be disserving one or both of these tables if I gave them exactly the same dish. This younger one, well, whichever one, let's say this is the younger one over here on the right. I need to raise the acidity slightly in this dish. I need to lower the acidity somewhat in the other table's dish. If it's a significantly older wine, I might even add with a toothpick a micro dot of hazelnut oil to echo some of the aromatics of a fully mature Chardonnay on its. I might say, for example, you know what? These clients ordered exactly the wrong food for this wine. They are all having a salad with vinaigrette as an appetizer because we're in America, and they've ordered a 30-year-old Grand Cru Chardonnay. Oftentimes, I would send them out a dish for free so they could see, maybe it was a little lobster dish with butter, so that they could experience that incredible wine with a food that wouldn't harm the taste perception. I'm sorry. So we've basically now identified these 2 schools of situation, these 2 arenas. If we're dealing with a wine that is a noble situation, what we mean is that all the following things are true. 1, it is one of the grapes that is identified as being noble, meaning it has the capacity for long-term aging with increasing complexity and beauty. Things like Chardonnay, Riesling, Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, and so forth. The second thing that has to attend, it has been grown on soil, on a plot of land that has been proven to be able to produce these long-term beautiful wines. Thirdly, the vineyard or the people in the field didn't make mistakes. Fourthly, the winemaker himself in the cellar assembling, making the wine, didn't screw it up. Next, that it was stored correctly and wasn't harmed in storage, sunlight, whatever, temperature variations. Next, that in transporting, whether overseas on boats or through trucks, it wasn't damaged. Next, storage wherever it's being held in the restaurant or a home, nothing went wrong. And finally, the final requirement is that it is at the edge or on its plateau of beauty. If all of those things hold, now we have a noble pairing situation. And of course, 100 years ago, this was understood to be the goal. People who were wine lovers cellared their own wines and didn't drink them until they reached that plateau. In fact, the job of a sommelier in a stately home was basically to have a catalog in his mind of where every single wine in that cellar is on its life curve. Because if you're dealing with an owner who has immense wealth, then there's no need, and it would be a flaw to bring any wine before it was at its maximum pleasure-giving potential. So if you were to bring out a bottle of wine and it was too young, the owner might grimace and think you don't know your job and have you replaced. If you were to know all the wines and bring them only when they are really, truly at their peak of beauty, this brings more pleasure. Yeah, but a problem started to happen. Though the cellar master, the sommelier, may be doing his job perfectly well. But the man in the kitchen, the chef, also is operating under the same principles. He goes to the market every day and he buys the very, very best thing he can find. He doesn't buy something that's inferior, and he brings it home and he cooks it to a way in which he wants to celebrate it the most. He wants to put before the Baron the most elevated turbo dish he's ever made in his life. But here's the problem. Along the way, if he made that turbo dish with highly acidic elements, or highly sweet elements, or highly spicy elements, that food might make the wine seem to turn bad. And the sommelier would get blamed. Why did you bring me a bad wine? Of course, over decades and decades, perhaps even centuries, certain principles, certain rules of thumb came to be observed. For example, we would never serve the salad in France until after the red wines are finished. Now that we understand the neurophysiology of this, these rules made sense. In France, you will never see a sweet dish served before dessert if serious dry wines are being served, and so forth. A whole litany of rules were observed to protect these very fine wines, these noble wines. And this whole body of knowledge came to be known as classical French cuisine. Roughly 30,000 dishes that do not disturb the palate's ability to perceive a wine accurately. The principle behind all of these classical dishes was much like the oyster. There can be plenty of protein flavor, but the condiment must be very subtle. and never high in acidity, never high in sweetness, never high in spice, heat spice, capsicum. Similarly, there are certain chemical compounds in some foods, like artichoke, which have a reaction against wine that is very unfavorable. Must never use artichoke, must never use raw garlic. These principles, in fact, it really should be said that calling it classical French cuisine was a misnomer. It really should have been called the cuisine of wine connoisseurs, because it is exactly the kind of food that was eaten the world over, whether in Australia, whether in South Africa, whether in London, whether in Paris, whether in New York or San Francisco, a century ago, even 60 years ago. People who collected fine wines served these type of neutral dishes from the classical repertoire. So this now gives us enough of an introduction to start making some ideas on how to proceed for yourselves. The first thing we have to decide is, which is the given? Are we in a situation where the food has already been chosen and we must choose a wine? Or we are in the situation where we've chosen the wine and now we must choose the food? Supposing in the first case, you've been invited to a dinner party and you want to bring a bottle of wine. So you ask the host, well, can you tell me what is the main course you're serving? Okay. The first thing you're going to say to yourself, that dish, does it sound like a classical French cuisine dish physiologically, chemically? That means, is it very neutral? Does it sound like it is not like a stew? If someone said a pot roast is very much like a Burgundian, it's not high in acidity. It's not high in sweetness. It's not got heat spice like capsicum. Gee, that sounds like a relatively neutral dish. I can therefore bring a wine that is at or near or on its plateau, fully mature. Which wine then becomes the question. And typically you could say, using just 2 or 3 nations, France and Italy and Spain, you could say, does that dish remind me of some European dish? And you would say, in the case of pot roast, why, of course it does. It reminds me of a pot au feu, which is what it is, a pot au feu in France. What region is that from? That region is Burgundy. Well, 1,000 years of experimentation of pairing food with that wine has been successful. In Burgundy, they will serve a Pinot Noir with that pot au feu. I can take a New World one. I can take an Old World Pinot Noir, but I want it to be fully aged, or as close as I can get to that. I don't want an ultra young one. Okay. Let's suppose that a different case. A manager, the host says that they are doing something that is yin yang, that has a lot of spice and flavor. We're doing Vietnamese green curry with chicken. Well, now you have a lot of acidity, lime juice, and you have a lot of sugar, palm sugar, and you have all these spices, and you have a lot of complexity. Well, this is the indication that I do not have a noble pairing situation. It's more of a peasant style situation. So I am going to want a wine that is not on the plateau, but is very young. Probably a wine that's very acidic. And then from here, we can begin to think about some pairings that have been working in the past in these types of situations. My mind immediately goes to something like, the white Rieslings of Alsace or other very acidic white wines. So to restate, to do the dynamic model wine pairings, we start with which is given, whether it is the dish that must be chosen for the wine or the wine that must be chosen for the dish. If starting with the wine is the given, we do. So if in this case, if we started with a wine, the first thing I'm going to do is this still versus swirled, still versus aspirated. Now I know whether I have a young wine, somewhere in the middle, or a fully mature wine. If I have a fully mature wine, then I must choose a dish that is relatively neutral, more in the manner of classical French cuisine. It doesn't have to be French. It just has to have those kind of neutral qualities. If we're starting with the food is given, we assess the dish's organoleptic qualities. Is the dish essentially neutral? Or meaning it will not greatly change the palate references? Then I'll go with a noble type of wine situation. And I use geography to help select. So if the dish has is pasta with white truffles, even if it's not an official Italian version of it, I'm going to be thinking about that region where that's made. Where the Barolos are, and if it was a steak with rosemary grilled, I might be thinking more of a barbaresco. I'm thinking like that. So I hope that this begins to indicate, without taking a long time, the sort of principles that you can develop. Very few simple tools, judging where a wine is on its life cycle. See, I think the most important thing to remember is this. In contrasting spirits to wine, spirits are bottled like you've fixed a negative in a photo lab. The minute that spirit is bottled, it ceases to age any longer. Or even in the cellars, they sometimes will put cognacs in jablons, glass containers where they actually melt and seal it so no air can ever enter, unlike a bottle which has a cork and air can microscopically, can migrate through the microscopic pores of the cork. But spirits are like a beautiful painting. Still. You've captured a snapshot in time. But wine is like a moving picture. Wine is like living tissue in the bottle. It goes through its entire lifespan. And so it is taking that fact into account that makes a dynamic pairing model appropriate. And I hope that if there are any questions, it's been a delight to share a little bit of this. As I said, on my YouTube channel, you can see a more full version of this, but I'm trying to stay within the time frame. And thank you. It's been a great honor.
Thank you very much, Greg. This has been a spellbinding lecture, as always. I always learned a lot from you. I'm going to open up the floor for questions from this wonderful audience, but allow me to take the chair's privilege of asking the first one. Now you are a master chef, you have explained very carefully how people used to take a particular wine and then design the cuisine around it. When you are designing a new dish, you are almost inventing one. What thoughts go in the back of your mind about what wine could be best used for this one? Is
Well,
there a sort of symbiotic relationship? I mean, do you have it at the back of your mind when you are inventing a completely new dish?
so I am different from most chefs because I started my interest in gastronomy with my uncles in France. I'm a dual citizen of America and France on my mother's side. And so it was they started me young, like when I was 14. We would take the morning ritual at 11 a.m. and go down into the cellar. There was a generational wine cellar. And we would normally pick a white Burgundy, a Grand Cru white Burgundy for lunch, and you'd have to blow the dust off. It was quite special. And then again, before dinner, we would go down and pick either a red Bordeaux or a red Burgundy, and they were usually at least Premier Cru. And so I've always been more of a sommelier than a chef with my creativity. I was hoping I could even find for you a picture. I don't know if it'll come across on my iPad here, of a dish that I made. Well, in fact, I would say that almost all the dishes that I created over the years were inspired by wine. And here's a perfect example of one. Let me see if you can see that. Here. There we go. So this is veal, 2 veal medallions. And the sauce around it, I call it Brunoise sauce. On it are flakes of dehydrated root vegetable. So this was the whole idea that I had tasted in 1990 Richebourg from Hudelot. And it was a transcendental experience. This wine was extraordinary. And so I said to myself, what are these extraordinary aromas that are happening? And then I said, how could I make a sensorium on the plate that could have fun with that? And I said, well, one of the many of the base notes of this red wine are earthy, root type vegetable notes, especially roasted beets. So I said to myself, well, if I were to dehydrate flakes, on a box grater, then dehydrate them, all different types, carrot, parsnip, parsley root, beets, red beets, yellow beets, etc., and then dehydrate them on silk pads in a dehydrator, combine them with a tiny bit of Wonder flour, and then take the raw veal, season it, and pan or put those flakes on it, and then saute them in the pan. That is served on top of Robuchon potato puree with grass-fed butter. As it sits there on top of the warm potato puree, the meat is going to give off, because of the abuse of the searing. It's going to leak some of its liquid and rehydrate those dehydrated flakes and awakening the aroma. So as that veal sits there, those dry flakes become moistened flakes, and suddenly those same articulated aromas of the base notes in the red Burgundy would start to appear. And then the sauce was serving to echo that, but in more of the high notes. So in the sauce is the truffle note of that same Hudelot wine, and some of the winey notes, because there was reduced wine, a touch of reduced port. And so this was exactly a perfect example of a dish that was entirely designed for a wine.
I'm going to open up the floor to other questions. In fact, may I request Amy Dunn to ask her question? She's put it in the chat, but I think, Amy, you can ask it by unmuting yourself, please.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Hi, Craig. I thought that was super fascinating. Thank you. I was just wondering, do you think that the presentation or the color of the food affects the perception of the wine at all when it's being served? And also, would you say, if you're doing a food and wine pairing dinner, you would suggest tasting the wine first and then tasting the food?
Yes. Oh, these are great questions. And the answer is yes and no. And strictly speaking, a person who's extraordinarily gifted in wine tasting should be able to come to the same conclusion whether he's blindfolded or not. Okay. No, so that is a very, very rarefied example, though. On the other hand, we well know that anything that affects our psychology will also affect our perceptions, right?
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree. This is why chefs will so often obsess over which plate to serve a dish on, even just the background, right? The crockery, or the which color, which shape, which pattern. Yes, these things interact in our mind playfully, and they make suggestions, they hint. Here, for example, is a dish I did, another dish completely about a wine. Let's see if I can get there. So this is called crayfish with the flavors of Condrieu. Condrieu is a white wine from the south of France, made from Viognier grapes, and there's sometimes notes of certain citrus, different herbs, and in this case, I was serving it on a transparent glass plate to give that psychological context of something that is ethereal, something that is aromatic, something that interplays in great delicacy. Okay, so that was the question about the colors and the presentations. But there was another question about opening the wine first, I believe. Is that right?
It was, would you, just bearing in mind, would you taste the wine if you're doing a food and wine dinner? Would you always suggest that the guests taste their wine before they then let it interact with the food? I
absolutely would. And may I tell you the funniest story? Is to take 2 minutes, but I had an extraordinary client at my restaurant, Steve Verlin, who was one of the biggest wine collectors in the world. And he had been coming to my restaurant time and time again, bringing his own, masterpiece treasures, 47 Cheval Blanc, on and on. And he said to me, I'm going to be turning 47 in a few months. And I'm going to be doing a dinner party of flights of wine, at least 14 courses. Each course will have at least 6 wines, and they will all be 47s. I'm saying, oh my God. And Craig, I would like you to cook it all. And I said, I'd be honored. By the way, Robert Parker, the great wine critic, will be one of the guests. I said, oh my God. When I arrived there, they were serving 1947 Cheval Blanc in Jeroboams as the cocktail wine. To tell you the truth, the value of those wines today would be upwards of $1 million. So the first flight came out 1947 champagnes, Krugs, and just mind-boggling stuff. And every time that Steve had come to my restaurant, he would always send a glass of whatever wine that he was pouring at the table that he had brought for me to taste, so that I could adjust the wines, so that I could adjust the food to maximally pair with the wine. And so it was in this party. I had one assistant, Michael, and they were sent into the kitchen, 2 glasses of each of the 6 wines for each course. But this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So none of the wine went to waste. Mm-hmm. We make it through the second course, the third course with the Rieslings from Alsace, and then we're into the Grand Cru Burgundies, starting with the Chablis, and then everything all the way through the Pinot Noirs, the red Burgundies, the Bordeaux, several courses of Bordeaux, and at that moment they're going to segue into the salad course. And I noticed that Michael is jumping up and down on one foot because we were cooking in a makeup kitchen in an alcove of the house, and there was no way to get out because all the glasses were stacked in front of us and this and that. And he said to me, indicated that he had to relieve himself. And I said, I have to too. And so I said, I don't know what we're going to do. And he said, well, why don't we open this window? So we opened the window and we ran to the edge of the property, a couple of acres away, and we started to relieve ourselves. And we were relieving and relieving and relieving. And finally, I looked to Michael and I said, do you realize that you're taking a $200,000 piss? And we laughed and laughed and laughed. Then we went back in the house and we served the first two dessert courses. And then finally there was a big surprise. And tiny little thimble size, like you would use for cordials, these glass came in with a liquid that was the darkest amber and complexity beyond belief. And it was announced that this was an 1847 Tokai Essentia. The provenance was announced as having come from the Tsar's cellar itself.
Wow.
So that was.
You have to unmute, Craig.
Sorry, that was quite a tasting experience. But to your point, we were given tastes of every single wine so that I could make final adjustments before serving the food. And yes, so that is a long-winded way of saying yes to your question.
Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one more question. So anybody who wants to ask it, please. We are going to be ending this in about 3 minutes. Craig, you will be receiving some questions from India and all that by email. So I'll count on your kindness to answer them as they come in. But if I don't seem to see any more questions, so allow me please to, on everybody's behalf, thank you for a extraordinarily fascinating and extraordinarily stimulating seminar. I feel very honored and privileged to have chaired this session and to welcome you to our midst. And next year, I'm looking to do something different when we'll be hopefully in a non-virtual era. I'll be rather keen that you meet some of our top people and we can all learn from your magnificent exposition. So thank you very much, Craig. I really am honored again. And I know I speak on behalf of everybody when I give you the applause and plaudits of thousands of people.
Well, thank you. The honor was all mine. I'm delighted to be able to help. Thank you so much.
Cheers.